Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Forum at First Presbyterian Church. Today is Sunday, October 2nd, and I forgot that we're doing church at Hastings College today. So good thing that there are gigantic signs on all of the doors. It is Sunday, October 2nd. We are delighted to have Dr. Dan Deffenbaugh here for a 4-week series on Christian salvation, a historical and biblical overview. So, Dan, I'm excited to learn more, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I realize that you're going to be heading out to Steinhardt Plaza for church, so I will certainly try to end several minutes prior to our regular time. But today, boy, what a overwhelming topic. And to make things worse, I'm not even going to focus today on Christian salvation at all. I'm just going to talk about the existential idea of salvation itself, and how it is that human beings have come to really develop this sense of need, of meaning, of value that requires that they have something to aspire to. So without any further ado, let me move to our first slide here. And I just want to have us think a little bit about the human condition. And as with everything I tend to do, I studied biology and religion in college. Incredible combination. So I always look at things through a biological and anthropological lens. And there is something that's really unique about human beings that I think places us in a unique situation, with respect to the rest of life on the planet. There are people who know this much better than I, especially you, Dr. Adam. But when you think about how we are born into the world, the human birth canal does not allow for a fully developed entity to come into the world, right? If we're going to give birth to children, the head has to be very small, the child has to be very small, and that child comes into the world basically undeveloped. And we have to develop that child. We have to care for that child for the next 2 or 3 years. This happens to every human being.
Or 30 or 40.
Yeah. Would you like to say more about that? But basically, we have to be in the presence of that child for the next 2 to 3 years, looking over everything they do. So imagine what happens in the head of that child. I mean, this is regardless of wherever you live. I mean, you can be in New Guinea, or you can be in Canada, or wherever. Children always need this kind of extended care. What happens in the head of that child? What happens in the experience, I should say, of that child? Well, over a 2 or 3 year period of time, children cannot help but think that they are what?
Center of the universe.
I'm the reason. I'm the reason for it all, right? I'm the center of it all. I cry, somebody comes and takes care of me. I'm hungry, somebody. If they're raised well, of course. Tragically, many children are not. If I'm hungry, mom comes and feeds me. If I venture out too far from the circle, somebody comes and gets me and draws me back. And so at age 2 or age 3 or so, the child is completely convinced that he or she is at the center of the world until he's not, or she's not, right? All of a sudden, mom has other kids. Right? Hey, why are you taking care of them, right? And so our whole life afterwards is like this gradual and very difficult unlearning of the idea that we are the center of the world. Now, Freud talked about this as an ego, the I, right? I am the center of all things. This creates the condition for the possibility of a very difficult life for what 40, 50, 60 years, right? Because we intuitively remember that at one time we had it all. Now this is Freud, okay? This is Freud's understanding of religion. And Freud says in order for us to appease that one-time desire, what we do, we create a God in the sky who takes care of us the way our mother did. So, that be that as it may, I think it's an interesting theory that doesn't necessarily, undermine any belief in the existence of God. But that was Freud, right? We have to unlearn all of this. This creates for us, throughout our life, what's called an existential dilemma. Individuality within finitude. On the one hand, we can imagine ourselves at the center of the world. It's all about us. We can imagine ourselves as little gods, basically, living forever, that all things really revolve around us. But at the same time, we know, and our experience tells us, that we are going to die. We are just simply going to fade into the dirt and become food for worms. That is a very difficult lesson to learn. I don't want to die. I want to be a god. I don't want to be food for worms. I want to live forever. This sets up what we can probably establish as the beginning of all religious, every impetus for religion, right? The question of death. If we look back at our oldest narrative that we know, the Epic of Gilgamesh, written around 2100 BCE, or at least having its oral source around 2100 BCE, what is the reason for this epic? I mean, it's a nice adventurous epic, but at the core of the epic is this wonderful king by the name of Gilgamesh. I mean, he's like the Elvis Presley of his day. He gets everything he possibly wants. He's kind of a bad boy in the beginning, taking things that aren't his. And then he's got this friend by the name of Enkidu. I don't want to tell you the whole story, but if you remember it from high school or college, Enkidu is symbolically very interesting because he's a half man, half animal. He's half human, half beast. And they come to be enemies, first of all, but then after fighting with each other and they can't overcome each other, they finally make a pact and become best friends. Now, this idea of the half animal, half human at the center of the story probably speaks to some sort of reflection in 2100 BCE about the human condition itself. It's the individuality within finitude. Are we something special, or are we just like the animals out there? And so that's what Enkidu represents. Gilgamesh, on the other hand, represents everything that humans aspire to. He's the king of Uruk, which is the town or the walled city that the very first chapter of the Epic of Gilgamesh talks about how beautiful this city is, this wonderful wall around it, all the crops and all the people and everything is in peace. He's everything that we could possibly want. He's his own little god, right? Mm-hmm. Well, Gilgamesh and Enkidu go off on, it's Enkidu. Boy, now I can't remember, Enkidu. But anyway, Gilgamesh and Enki, whatever his name is, they go off on all kinds of adventures, and one of their misadventures is that Enkidu, I think it's Enkidu, kills the bull of heaven. This is that image that we see on the front of one of the volumes of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And as a result, brings upon him the ire and the wrath of the gods. Enkidu dies. The gods come down upon him and kill Enkidu. And this causes great anguish in Gilgamesh. He never really pondered death before until his best friend the person who was almost, his twin, so to speak, and he goes off on a search for immortality. I want to know the meaning of life. I want to go to the gods, and I want to be a person who does not die. I want to live forever. And there are a number of stories that ensue after this, of course, and it's not really the focus of our talk today, but one of the things that's really interesting to note is that the Epic of Gilgamesh finds its place in the Hebrew tradition. If you read the so-called mythic chapters of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, the creation of the world, the fall, you've got Noah, you've got the building of the Tower of Babel, all of those stories, two of those stories come right out of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which blows my students' minds when I tell them that. These stories were probably written in the Hebrew Bible around 950 at the earliest. But by 2100, there's a story of a man by the name of Utnapishtim who understands that the gods are going to destroy creation. So he builds an ark and he puts all the animals on this big boat, and thus is able to save all of humanity. Gods destroy creation, but he is able to survive. There's also this story about Gilgamesh, and of course that's the Noah story, right? Gilgamesh has this time with the gods, and they give him a hint. They say, "Okay, look, we'll give you the possibility if you can find this particular herb, really it's a flower, at the bottom of the ocean, that will give you eternal life. You won't ever die." So Gilgamesh goes off after his, this is the end of the story, really. He goes off, he dives deep down into the ocean at great possible harm to himself. He brings this sacred plant out of the ocean, and because he's so tired, he goes off to the shore, crashes, lays it down, and a snake comes along, a serpent, and steals the flower, and thus has eternal life. So basically, our whole, I guess the outcome of the story is, our whole attempts at trying to overcome this idea of dying, they're going to be foiled. Now, the snake, of course, this is the story that we see in Genesis, right? Why do we think the snakes have eternal life? Well, they're constantly, people in 2100 BCE or whatever, have you ever seen a snake when it's molting? It looks dead. It looks like that thing's gone. Then all of a sudden it pops out and its skin is behind it, and you have resurrection, and this happens. So there's this cycle of existence, right, that we perceive and experience in the natural world. Some things die and come back again. Look at the snake. He dies and he comes back to life again. How can we I want some of that. How can I get some of that, right? So we're talking 4,000 years ago, and I'm thinking about the existential experience of human beings. Even before we're 1,000 years away before the Hebrew Bible is even, written. But anthropologically, we have experiences that confound us. And the one that is the most confounding is this idea of our utter demise, especially given our auspicious beginnings as the center of the world. And so every attempt in world religions to talk about something that we know of as salvation. Now, I want to point out, salvation is not the end goal of all the world religions, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But every attempt that we have to achieve some sort of salvation is an attempt to address the human existential dilemma to come to terms with the enormity of death. Are we gods, or are we simply food for worms? It's a haunting question, and it is our inheritance as Homo sapiens. So any questions or comments about that so far? if you really like this idea of the denial of death being at the source of a lot of cultural artifacts, there was a man by the name of Ernest Becker who wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, I think in 1972, called just that, The Denial of Death. I read this book when I was in college, completely rocked my world. There's Dan before Ernest Becker, and there's Dan after Ernest Becker. I mean, it's that monumental of a text for me. So let's move on. Now, I want to, unless there are questions, I want to talk a little bit about philosophy, which lies at the source of religion. And there are two types of religious traditions, which really correspond to two ways to answer this question. Are we gods or are we food for worms? One type of religious tradition, which generally falls into the Western religious traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is an ego-affirming religion. You are gods. You have the potential to live forever. You can do it, you know. Of course, you need some help from the gods to do it, but our religious tradition affirms this about you and affirms this about the world. Now, Eastern religions, now this is generally the case, okay, because you have this issue like Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So you're not really dividing it geographically. It's more, well, metaphysically. How do we see the world, right? Eastern religions say, no. The problem is that you think you're gods. You know, the problem is your ego. And if you want anything approximating salvation, get rid of your ego. This is at the source of Hinduism, at the source of Buddhism, and it's the source really. In Christianity, there is a tradition that I find very attractive called Christian mysticism, which also, focuses on taking on the humility of putting your ego aside. You're not that important, okay? But you are part of something greater. Now, if you think about when people started to philosophize about the world, and let's get up to about the year 1000 BCE, and let's go to India. And books like the Upanishads are being written, the Mahabharata. All of these tales are very much like the Epic of Gilgamesh. They usually involve some sort of aristocratic prince or king involved in some sort of battle, hoping to achieve some sort of notoriety in life and thus attain some sort of immortality, but is foiled in the process. When people are starting to think about these ideas, there are four possibilities. I call this a basic quadrant. When you think about your experience of the world, there are four ways of looking at how you relate to the world. This is the Western quadrant. I am, I exist, and there is. The world exists. I am real, the world is real. The Eastern quadrant is, I am not, I don't exist. That's an illusion. The world doesn't exist. That's an illusion as well. That's what we find in Hinduism and Buddhism. You all also have varieties on this, right? I am, but the world is not. And I am not, but the world is. So there are, four possibilities there. We, of course, I'll explain this much later on, but we fall into this, duality right here. The world is real, I am real. Why? Because it's guaranteed by a God who loves us and creates the world for a particular purpose. If you think about some of the basic ideas that we hold to be true. For example, if you were to draw a picture of time, I'd call on Bev to come up and draw a picture of time, what would you do?
The straight line is how we live.
Oh, wow, would you? Yeah, that's wonderful.
A human,
right?
Yeah.
What are you talking about? There's no straight line. The straight line suggests a beginning and an end, right?
That's what we
Start
do.
here, boom, you end there. And if you have a God who has created you for a particular purpose, you are, and you exist, then you can mark your purpose by steps along that line. We all understand that, right? That's a relatively recent phenomenon in human experience. And I'll tell you when it happened. I'll tell you the story about when it happened. Abraham lived in Ur of the Chaldeans. Now that is Uruk, that is Gilgamesh's city. And they understood, they were an agricultural people, they understood time to be cyclical. Winter, spring, summer, fall. And it was their responsibility to appease the gods so that the cycle of the seasons would guarantee the crops every year. You do certain rituals so that the rain falls, so that the rivers flood at this time of the year. You do all these things, but the gods have nothing to do with people down here. The gods are way up here. They have, in fact, the people down here are kind of nuisances. So you always had to appease them, right? Got to give them something to eat. So we offer burnt sacrifices, the smoke ascends. You know what, how wonderful meat burning smells, right? The smoke ascends, the gods eat that way, and they say, okay, well, look, we'll let the rivers flood. We'll let the rains come. It was a cycle of the seasons, went over and over and over again. It didn't have a beginning, it didn't have an end, it was just continuous. Well, Abraham lived on the outskirts of Ur, the Chaldeans, much later than Gilgamesh, of course, 1,000 years later. And two things happen with Abraham. First of all, a God taps him on the shoulder, right? And says, hey, I want to create a relationship with you. And Abraham's like, wow, are you serious? I mean, you're a God. I mean, you're way up here and I'm way down here. What's this all about? Not only that, I have a purpose for you. I want you to go to the land that I'm going to show you. Now that experience in human history, let's not call it history. Nobody was there saying, okay, Abraham, then this happened to Abraham. This is a myth. This is something that happened in the human mind that changed our understanding of the world. Abraham started out in the world, see how I can use this, a world in which time looked like this. Winter, spring, summer, and fall, winter, spring, summer, and fall. In fact, he was on the outskirts. He was an outsider. He didn't even live within the walled city. He was kind of one of these dirty people that herded animals and everything. But when a God comes to him and says, I want to call you by name, in fact, I'm going to give you a new name, and I'm going to show you where to go, all of a sudden the experience of human time becomes this. Because now Abraham can determine his steps along the way in completion of the task that God has placed before him. So you can understand how linear time goes hand in hand with this idea that I have a purpose, right? And this world is created by the God who's got the same purpose for me. Those are the Western traditions that we know of. But there's a much more, let me stop, see if there are any questions about linear time versus cyclical. We still see vestiges of cyclical time, right? Look behind us, clock on the wall, right? It haunts us. I mean, symbolically, that clock says, don't be so sure that you're going anywhere. That clock is saying, it just keeps going again. It's not going anywhere. It's just going to go around and around. The sun rises, the sun sets, the sun, you're just caught up in this cycle. But the Western tradition says, no, that's not true. The clock may try to convince us that we're not important. But we know through our faith and through the way that we understand the world that there is purpose here, that I exist and the world exists. Not true in the Eastern religious traditions. If you read the Upanishads probably written around 700 of the Common Era, or before the Common Era, And then later, a person who would reform Hindu thinking, a man by the name of Siddhartha Gautama, known as the Buddha, their approach to the world is, the Upanishad says, yeah, there is a world out here. But you as an individual, you just don't mean anything. You're all part of something greater called Brahman. Here's the word I'm using right here. Brahman is like the spiritual foundation of all things. It is like the ocean into which every single one of us individual drops of water, fall and become one with. Now, the illusion that you have is that you are an individual. There's Matt Fong over there, city council. Look at all those great, accolades you can add to your name. You've got you graduate of Hastings College. You did great things there. You just all these little badges. It doesn't mean anything. It just fades away, right? And you find if the Upanishads say you're just going to create more and more suffering for yourself if you live under the assumption that you actually mean something, because you don't. You are just a manifestation of this greater reality called Brahman. It's really kind of beautiful, if you think of it. Your experience in the world is completely unique, right? There's no other Matt Fong experience that has ever existed on this planet, ever. There's no other Bev, every single one of you has had an experience that is utterly unique to yourselves. Now, that is important, but it is nothing more, right? Remember your drops of water. The ocean, Brahman, creates these drops of water in order to experience the world in a particular way, but those drops of water go back into Brahman and give Brahman a sense of the multifariousness of existence. And it's infinite, right? But you're just a vessel along the way. There is no self on Atman. Your karma, the energy that you produce in the world is going to determine, again, this is what it looks like in terms of life, death, and rebirth. There's something called samsara, which is rebirth. Your decisions, which are created by your desire, create something called karma. And you can have bad karma or good karma, right? You probably have heard about this. One illusion I'm going to dispel, speaking of illusions, is that karma is something, you hear people say, oh, that's going to make for bad karma. That karma doesn't affect you in this life. That karma affects you in another life. So you are constantly being reborn into a new life. Here you are over here. And then next time around, depending on how good your karma was, you can become, let's say you're just a lowly worker here, but you're a great worker, you're loyal to your employer, all of those things. It's kind of anachronistic because there weren't employers at the time. But you're a good peasant. You're loyal, you don't lie, you don't steal. Well, in the next life, you might become a warrior, right? You pop up on. So life is nothing more than this constant, and it never begins, and it never ends. And there are manifestations of you all along the way, based upon what you do in this life. And there are levels of existence, right? There are gods up here. There's something called hungry ghosts down here. And there's everything in between. Animals, then, the levels of existence that we call caste. And this is the way that they maintain the caste system in India, right? Don't worry, you just do your job there. This is classic Karl Marx, right? Religion's the opiate of the people. It keeps people subservient, waiting for a better chance some other time, waiting for heaven to come along. That's what it looked like in Hinduism. But all of it is this idea. Now, the idea is, if you really want to get off of the circle and not be reborn, you have to take on spiritual exercises that are going to limit your desire. Because desire creates karma. Karma is the energy that bolts you into the next life. Suffering is caused by desire. If you want to stop suffering, stop desiring. And thus you enter into this ascetic life. So there is a reality that you can kind of fall into and become one with, and that's called Brahman. Brahman is like this whole thing right here. Brahman is the energy that is as the core of all of creation. And if you want to get off of that wheel, basically stop desiring and then become one with Brahman. Lose your identity. So Hindus will adhere to this metaphysical understanding of the world. Yeah, there is a reality. And it's called Brahman. It's a spiritual reality. This world of physical existence is all an illusion. Your individual self is an illusion. The longer you hold on to that self, the more you're going to live in the illusion. The more, if you easily give up the ego, then you can become one with Brahman and thus achieve kind of salvation. You'll never be born into this again. Now, I don't want to get too much into Buddhism here, but the Buddha was going to actually challenge this idea that there's a Brahman at all. And Buddhism, the thing that's going to make Buddhism different is they're going to hold to this quadrant, this part of the quadrant that says there's not anything permanent out there. And they're including yourself. Hindus believe that Brahman was this thing that did not change. It was, wasn't part of the change of this illusory world. The Buddha said, no, even that doesn't exist. As long as you think it still exists, you're going to desire it. And if you desire it, you're going to create karma, and you're going to get caught back up in the system again. So that is as close as we come to the idea of salvation in the Eastern religions. Why am I talking about this if this whole class is on Christian theology and biblical? Is because we live in a really a very diverse world, and there are aspects of this Eastern philosophy that really was introduced in the United States around the 1950s. You might know the beat poets like Allen Ginsberg, and Jack Kerouac. They were big into Buddhist philosophy. And in California, Buddhist philosophy got introduced, and now we have self-help books written on mindfulness and all these things. One thing that's kind of funny about self-help, you would think that they would have worked themselves out of a job by now, right? But the self-help industry just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But one of the things that's big in the self-help industry now is mindfulness, just being mindful of your awareness. And Buddhists, a lot of Buddhist practitioners are referring to it as Mick mindfulness, like Mick Mansions. And it's a U.S. American appropriation of something that has absolutely nothing with our understanding of how the world works. If you're going to talk about Buddhist mindfulness, then you need to accept all of this that we're talking about here. You need to accept their metaphysical view of the world. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. And so we have people dabbling into this kind of idea, but to really understand it and to accept it as a kind of salvation, actually, Buddhists call it enlightenment, seeing how things really are. If you're really going to be part of that, then you have to accept the whole metaphysical reality. You can't talk about mindfulness and talk about enlightenment and still say I am and the world exists. You can't talk about mindfulness and enlightenment and still be part of the capitalist system that, causes you to build your portfolio, year after year. It just doesn't work. So, so when we talk about salvation, is why I'm bringing this up, there are going to be people who are going to throw, these kind of, let's say, spices into the main Christian meal. There'll be Buddhist and Eastern approaches to salvation. Another one, let me stop and see if there are questions about this.
This is so unsettling, I will tell you. I'm looking at your basic quadrant up there.
Yeah.
And I am looking at Eastern religion so differently right now.
Yeah.
And it's like we're carrying them on our backs because we believe there's something to this world.
Yes.
And you think about environmental issues, and if they're just looking at this as an illusion,
Mhm.
we're carrying them to keep our earth well, I
Right.
would say, from what you're saying,
Yes.
right?
Yes. And you can, well, actually Buddhism allows for it'd be hard to talk about in just a single sentence, but there's a person in Buddhism called the Bodhisattva. And the Bodhisattva is one that reaches enlightenment, but before reaching this point of nirvana where he, completely extinguishes his desire and everything, he looks back and says, how can I possibly do this when the rest of the world is suffering? So I am going to hold off on nirvana, hold off on extinguishing my ego, and I'm going to return and I'm going to teach compassion. Compassion for all things, right? All things are suffering. And most things are suffering as a result of our ego desires, right? That whole sense of wanting to achieve some sort of, salvation for ourselves, some sort of assurance that we actually matter in the world. So in Buddhism, there is something known as the Green Sangha movement right now. But what you say, just based on the information I'm giving you here, is the logical conclusion to what I've just laid out here. But there are exceptions to that rule that I won't get into for this class. But it comes back to the Bodhisattva, if you can remember that. You probably heard it before, right? And many Buddhists look at Christ, at Jesus, as a Bodhisattva. But yes, environmentalism, when this world is an illusion, but what impetus do you have? What motivation do you have to take care of it?
That's it. The motivation
Right.
is what I think is missing
Right.
from what you're telling me, which I was not aware of.
Yeah, and what I've always thought about this with respect to, Japanese whaling. Why is it that the Japanese are, just have been so obstinate not to abide by international whaling rights or whaling laws? You just simply ignore them altogether. There's a sense like, well, those are resources that are ours and we're going to use them. And perhaps it has something to do with this idea that this world doesn't exist. However, their form of Buddhism would not support that, so I don't even know why I brought it up. There are a variety of Buddhisms out there and a variety of Hinduisms too. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
I have a sense that I understand there's a difference between Eastern religions and Western religions.
Yep.
I know of Buddhism and I know of Hinduism.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about the differences of what you're talking about here. Is there a way of talking about those two? And I'm going to say they're the two main Eastern religions. I don't know if that's true or not, but assuming it is there a way of talking about them and what impact they have on cultures in our world today to differentiate? And I guess I'm thinking that India is a Hindu nation.
Yeah.
It isn't
Nationalist.
It isn't unifiedly Hindu, but the majority I think are Hindu. I have relatives and friends in Thailand. Thailand is a Buddhist nation, and lots of others I know.
Right.
Any way of taking those two religions and translating them into today's world and how they impact the cultures that they come out of, or that come out of them, I guess maybe more.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, actually, this is in a very, very cursory way is what I'm trying to do here. I think the main thing I want to say is their religious traditions serve as lenses through which they see the world. The world is not real. This world is just all an illusion for most of the Eastern religious traditions. Now, that has ramifications. Why is it that science never developed? Why is it that mathematics developed in India early on, but science and technology never did? Why is it that the Chinese used gunpowder to make firecrackers and fireworks, but never thought of making it for military purposes, dynamite, things like that? Because of this idea that, why manipulate the world when the world's not real? It's going to fall apart on you.
Well, that speaks to what we've learned about China over the years, is that they had the early inventions for many things, but they didn't travel beyond their borders. They stayed home.
Yeah.
They didn't go out into the world
Yeah.
and share ideas with people.
Right.
And so it stunted them for a while, although they were the originators of a lot of our ideas, right?
What ideas specifically?
Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. Didn't they do some of the first printing?
Oh, yeah, printing and paper and things like that, sure. They use their technology for primarily aesthetic purposes.
Yeah.
And we tend to use technology for more, I guess, consequential types of purposes. I'm going to employ this in order to do that, instead of I'm going to employ this. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And this, when we get back to, remember we were talking about the child who's 2 years old, and one of the things the child eventually learns is to distinguish it between us and them, which leads to a kind of tribalism, right? And the Chinese, they were very tribal in that respect as well. Not as if they fought each other like crazy up until, just very recently. But I was thinking about this morning, 170 people were killed in Indonesia yesterday as a result, basically, of a tribal mentality. They lost a soccer game. My God, no. What induces us to put? I mean, it could have easily have happened at Husker Stadium, right? Same kind of tribalism. What induces us to put so much, sense of identity into these larger entities that come to represent our ego? It's an extension of our ego, right? Well, if you're going to tell me that I'm not that important at age 3, if I'm going to be told, at least by my experience, that I'm just one of many, then I'm going to associate myself with the many, and I am going to work towards their greatness, and I'm going to convince myself, as the many have, that we are special apart from the rest. Now we're getting into the Hebrew tradition, aren't we? We're special apart from the rest. Oh yeah, I should probably end right now. Thanks.
No, I have to go. You guys go.
But that kind of tribalism is something that we can, even though this happened, of course, in an Eastern country, but that kind of tribalism really comes back to this problem of ego, right? I'm special. I'm special apart from you, and that leads us to do things that can sometimes lead us to violate just basic moral or human rights principles, right? We justify it by this return to the ego as being the all important. So I really am attracted to Eastern religions. However, I'm attracted to the idea, not so much that I don't exist, but that I'm a part of a larger community that has a purpose that's defined by a God who is the guarantor of our existence. The idea of progress, the idea of science. Actually, it's where I was going to go after this, and I'll have to do it next Sunday, next Sunday. Why is it that science developed in the West and not so much in the East? What is science but observations of the world and creating hypotheses that you can test and determine, what kind of laws govern the world? How can you do that if you don't believe the world is, something you can rely on? It's illusion. It's all, sure, the water falls from there to there today, but, are you really perceiving it the way you're supposed to? How do you know tomorrow it's not going to, fall from there to there, which is something scientists ask themselves as well. But science grows up out of the Christian tradition precisely because I'm created in the image of God. God is a rational God. God created a world that exists. My knowledge of this world is in some ways a knowledge of God. Isaac Newton, Galileo, all of the early scientists were theologians, essentially. They were just reading the book of nature, not the book of scripture. Now the problem comes, and I'll end on this. The problem comes when the book of nature contradicts the book of scripture. And that was Galileo's problem, wasn't it? I posit that, Galileo said, if I'm watching the planets correctly, mathematically, it doesn't make sense that they should travel in the cosmos like this. But if I posit that the sun is the middle of the cosmos, of our galaxy, let's say, he didn't use those words, instead of the earth, then the math all works out. So despite what your Bible says, Mr. Pope, my science tells me that the earth is not the center of the universe, but the sun is the center of the universe. And that got Galileo in trouble, and that has been the conflict ever since. But we wouldn't have science if we did not have the basic metaphysical affirmation that this world is something that we can rely on. That the water will fall day after day from this place to this place until the water runs out. I had so many other things. I did want to talk about science. I love this little graphic right here. This is Copernicus looking out into the veil of the heavens and looking at all the mathematical principles by which they're governed. We'll talk about that next time. We'll also talk about this character who offers his own form of salvation as well. And why am I doing this? Because these are aspects of what we hear about the idea of salvation in the world that we live in right now. Science is salvation. Mysticism is salvation. Prosperity gospel is salvation. When we come back, I want to really just look at the Hebrew Bible and the Christian tradition. We'll talk about heaven, we'll talk about hell, all those kinds of things. And along the way, I will point out, and I think this is what you're asking, Chuck, I will point out how Eastern traditions or how science or how ego-oriented traditions like prosperity gospel influence our understanding of what happens when we die, which is not the whole focus of salvation. So influence the idea of salvation. So with that, I'm going to bid you adieu. And thank you, Matt.
Yes, closing remarks. Just a reminder, 3 more weeks. Thank you, Dan. Dan, thank you. I always feel like every time I listen to something that you talk about, it stretches my mind. So I appreciate that. I appreciate that a lot.
That is the idea.
So thank you. I do appreciate that. Just a reminder for any of our folks that are virtual, we will continue to post these sessions on the website and have them available virtually if you happen to miss any of our sessions coming up. So thank you again, Dan. Yeah.